Okay, good. Okay, so we're up and running. I'm just going to start with a prayer, and this comes from one of the books that I've been basing the pictures on. This was the pictures in this book are the ones that are the very stark black and white pictures, um, and by Nicholas Markel. Um, and I'm actually going to read the prayer from the Anglican stations for the week, um, based on Jesus carrying his cross. So one of the last ones that we saw last week. Lord Jesus, you carried the cross through the rough streets of Jerusalem. Be with those who are loaded with burdens beyond their strength. You bore the weight of our sins when you carried the cross. Help us to realize the extent and the cost of your love for us. To you, Jesus, bearing a cross not your own, be honor and glory with the Father and the Spirit, now and forever. Amen.
Amen.
And I'm going to read the whole of the section in Matthew 15 that covers the 4 sets of pictures we're going to watch tonight. But don't take a breath because you might miss it. Mark 15 says, they compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. And that will only relate to one of the images that we see tonight, or one set of images that we see. The other 3 sets of images are not mentioned in the Bible at all. We have Jesus meeting his mother. We have Simon of Cyrene, and we have Veronica, and we have Jesus falling for the second time. And it's just interesting when you sort of analyze it like this, how little the Stations of the Cross are based on what's in the Bible compared to what has become added to it over the years by different stories. And we'll touch on some of those as we go through. So here we are with Chris Shawcross. And if you remember those images from staining in the Catholic Church there, the left-hand side, the ones that are out of the book and the posters, and the right-hand side is the picture as it is in situ, hanging on the wall. And here we have Jesus meeting his mother, which is the 4th station, but the first one tonight. And if you remember from last week, Jesus was in like workman's clothes, and he's got his crown of thorns on his head. The soldiers are dressed as soldiers in contemporary dress. So it will be just as you might see a soldier in Jerusalem or anywhere else at the moment. And then Mary is coming and approaching Jesus, reaching out to him, being held back by the soldier, which is, I think, an interesting image, and one that gives us pause for thought, particularly with the Israel-Palestine situation at the moment and what's going on. But I love 2 things about this picture. One is Mary's hand being held, but the other hand stretching out towards Jesus, and his hand stretching out towards her, kind of a bit like the ceiling of the chapel where the hand of God is giving that spark of life. It's based, I think, around that image of 2 hands close together. But I also direct you to look at Mary's left foot. Mary's left foot is actually over the edge. You see what I mean? That I think it's really interesting the way that the carver has not just added her to the picture, but her foot is over the edge. She's on the edge. She's reaching into the frame. She's reaching into what's happening. And it's those little touches which I think are so good in this. And if you look now that I've magnified it a bit, the soldier is actually holding his weapon across Mary, and Mary's got one hand on the weapon and the other hand reaching out. So even in what seems to be a fairly straightforward little sculpture, the artist is showing us all sorts of different facets of what's going on and encouraging us to enter into the scene and be part of it.
That brought to mind Alexei Navalny's, what's gone on in this last
Yes,
week, with his mother.
yeah,
You could just sort of imagine the soldiers or whoever, prison guards or whatever, trying to hold her back.
yes, indeed. Yes, and somebody was making the point, without wanting to draw too many parallels between him and Jesus. Here was somebody who was prepared to give his life for what he believed in, that he went to prison and has ultimately died because of his political beliefs and the way that he wanted to stand up. I mean, he voluntarily chose to go back to Russia. He could have stayed away in exile, and then was well tried, if I can use that in inverted commas, and imprisoned. From the forest stations in Lincoln Cathedral, on the left-hand side, the full picture, um, a complete slice through a tree this time, so you can see the rings of the tree and some of the bark images. And then in the close-up, you can't see either Jesus or Mary, just the hands grasped together. And if you remember from last week, the cross beam is actually tied onto Jesus's arm using, I think it's willow, strips of willow, and then Mary's hand reaching into his hand. And so it's almost as if she's holding his arm up. It struck me that it's almost like a sign of victory. You know, when a boxer wins or somebody else wins, and the two people, somebody rushes over and takes hold of his arm and holds it up in the air in a sign of victory. And it's almost as though this is before the crucifixion. Mary and him are making that sign of victory, two arms up in the air together. We'll move on to Southwellminster, the next door diocese, and I've got a few things to show you from which regard this image or this set of images tonight. The picture I took is not terribly good, so I'm thankful I found some other pictures that are a bit more clear. I encourage you to look at the one on the left first of all, where Jesus is bent over under the weight. I mean, the cross is actually almost touching the ground. If you look on the right hand image, you can just see light underneath the cross arm. But Jesus is weighed down and his head is down. He can't look at his mother because of the weight that's on his shoulder. And then the right hand image, you can see Mary looking on to him. And I mean, it's very simplified, as we said last week. These are little blocks. You'll see a bit later how they make this. So little blocks, no arms, just stylized figures telling the story. But what I also find interesting in this picture, if you look on the above the cross on the left-hand picture, are two children. So you have men and women together and children there. And I guess it probably was true. I had an interesting conversation with a family last week about whether a child or children in the family should come to a funeral and whether we should let them see these things. Is it better for them to be there and experience it or stay at home and not be present? The child was incredibly upset on the day of the funeral, but I think on balance, I would say it was more important that she was there and saw what it really was like, rather than being at home and imagining what it was like. But the thought of children actually watching a crucifixion, and it must have happened in this country when we had executions. I mean, at Tyburn and Tower Hill, when there were public executions, there would have been children there. And what was happened to them? Would they have been traumatized by what they saw? It really doesn't bear thinking about. a rather more tender image, this one from the Benedictine sisters. And two things struck me about this as well. One is that Mary is in white, as is Jesus. Often in religious paintings, Mary is depicted in blue or sometimes in pink, but she's in white. And if you notice, the halo encompasses both of them. You haven't got two halos, you've got one halo over both of them together. I have to say, Jesus doesn't exactly seem to be under pressure in carrying the cross in this. It's more as if the cross is, well, sort of resting on the ground behind him and he's now able to come. I know his left shoulder is under the cross, and you can't see his left hand, but it's almost as if they can have a full embrace and be together. I guess my question would be, what did Mary say? What would have passed between them? What did he say to her? What did she say to him? From the Eulalia Clark's series, Mary here depicted in blue but with a white headscarf. And interestingly, Jesus is being tended to her, isn't he? She's got almost an attitude of prayer wringing her hands, perhaps. Jesus's cloak is already stained red with the blood, but he's the one reaching out to her rather than her to him. And I do think it's interesting to look at the crowd. This is an intimidating crowd. The bared teeth, the people in the top left-hand corner who are, I don't know, shouting, booing almost. In the cacophony of it all and the anger of it all, there's a tender moment between Jesus and Mother. Well, I hope you've already begun to see the reason I wanted to do this, which is to show how different artists just bring a different expression into the image. So Jesus meeting his mother, well, it's not them just meeting in the street and shaking hands, is it? But each of the artists brings a slightly different take on it, reaching out, being held back, embracing, not being able to look each other in the eye, or here, Jesus being tender to his mother, who is undoubtedly going to be in tears and upset. And any of all of those will have been how it was. Any of all of those are how we are in such circumstances when there's pain and grief involved. Since I showed these images last week, the work of Margaret Adams Parker has been picked up by the church in Scotland. And there is a set of devotions based around the images, which come from a totally different book, come from America. And they've now written new prayers by Muriel Pearson, who I think is a Church of Scotland minister, trying to take what's going on in Gaza particularly and make sense of that alongside these Stations of the Cross. It was advertised through Methodism earlier in the week, and if you want the link and to have a look at it, it's a PDF that you can download for the different views. Then by all means drop me an email and I'll let you have it. But Muriel Pearson has picked out a number of Bible readings, some of which are actually used within the Anglican services for Stations of the Cross. But the first one, "O Jerusalem, beloved Jerusalem, what can I say? How can I comfort you? No one has ever suffered like this. Your disaster is boundless as the ocean. There is no possible hope." Written, what, 2,500, nearly 3,000 years ago, and yet speaks so loudly into the current situation. And words perhaps we'll come back to when we look next week at the women of Jerusalem. And then the second one is from the story of Ruth. Don't call me Naomi, she answered. Call me Mara. And the little A is because at the footnote says that Mara means bitter, because Almighty God has made my life bitter. When I left here, I had plenty, but the Lord has brought me back without a thing. Now, if you remember, her husband died and she went back with her mother-in-law to the strange land of Israel, because that was where her husband had come from and her mother-in-law had come from. And then this is the prayer that has been written on it. And I'm going to have to just move it around. Oh, that. Oh, there we go. Mary in mourning, shrouded in grief, your bitter tears fall for all mourning mothers, for all fathers who have buried a child, and all children orphaned in calamity. May grief lead not to rage and vengeance, but to brave encounters with others also grieving, a longing for a different coexistence. In costly solidarity we pray. Amen. As I say, written particularly for the people of Gaza, but also with that reference to Jerusalem, the people of Israel. Just looking at the picture for a moment, you will notice that Mary, by comparison with some of the earlier images that we've looked at, is undoubtedly an old lady here. I mean, we don't quite know how old Mary was. It's always assumed that Mary was 16, around that, or something like that, when she had Jesus, maybe a bit older. We assume that Jesus was 33, but again, there's nothing actually that tells us that. So add the two together, you get to 49. Well, I think it's grief that's etched in her face as well as old age, but she certainly looks to be a much older woman than in many of the images. And grief, they say, ages you, don't they? This is Noyes Capehart, the American person. I wanted to read a little bit about what it said about him today. Noyes Capehart's woodcuts depict the 14 stations of the cross. They are traditional in that they visually narrate specific scenes from Jesus' passion and death, with individuals shown in the contemporary address of the day. And then it says, seeing Jesus as fully human helped understanding and feeling the full human agony of the sacrifice. Seeing his tormentors as human beings like themselves underscored their own sinfulness and need for forgiveness. Today, many people still need to see the various scenes portrayed as realistic narrative of events. Through the process of meditation, using and then transcending the here and now of the senses, the worshipper moves beyond simply understanding the storyline into an actual awareness of God's presence. Read that last line again. Through the process of meditation, using and then transcending the here and now of the senses, the worshipper moves beyond simply understanding the storyline into an actual awareness of God's presence. And again, it's that sense of trying to draw you into the picture, draw you into imagining you are there, you're witnessing what's happening. Couple of new people tonight. The first one is Frank Roper. There are 4 images of the Stations of the Cross in the Methodist collection of modern Christian art. And I presume that he did a full set, and I'm not quite sure why we own 4 of them and not all of them. But Frank Roper almost exclusively worked in metals. And you can see from these panels of wood, which are about 2 to 3 inches wide, how big these are. They are on wooden frames. They don't very often come out with the collection because they are of a different nature, and they are a bit more susceptible to damage. They don't usually tour, but occasionally they are available for people to see. And so we're going to look at two tonight out of the four, and the other two will come later on in the sequence, towards the end of the sequence. So Jesus meeting his mother, you can see that she's there on the left. Again, the hands are the significant contact between them. Both have open palms. She's got her hands out towards him, almost as if she wants to hold him again like a baby. He has his hand out towards her, perhaps in a sense of a motion of offering. These are cast. So I presume that they were worked, I think, in wood and then casting made of them. I'm not sure. I must look that up before we see the later ones. And then I just put this modern one in, which I thought was fascinating. Yeah, it's Mary. She's crying. She's in black for mourning. I'm not entirely sure what the little vertical line is in the middle, but it struck me she's almost wearing a burqa. I don't know whether that was part of the intention. Of course, one of the things that links us with people of Islam is that they do accept Jesus as a prophet, and a prophet who was put to death. And they venerate Mary as much as many Christians would. In fact, in some ways, perhaps more. When I was doing my tour of the seven churches of Revelation in Turkey, we went to the place where supposedly Mary is taken after all this by John. And up in the hills, there's a place called Mary's house, which is where she's reputedly lived. I have to say it was a 19th century German Lutheran pastor's vision that meant he decided this was where it was. So I don't think there's a lot of historical truth to the story. But it was interesting when we went because there were Christian pilgrims there, but there were a significant number of Islamic pilgrims, Muslim pilgrims there as well. And of course, being in Turkey in a Muslim country, that wasn't too surprising. But the number and the depth of devotion to Mary really stuck with me and I have to say surprised me. So perhaps the person who drew this, designed this, perhaps did have something of that burqa image in mind. After all, if Mary was a Palestinian woman, today she very often would be dressed like that.
Do you think that bit in the middle is her hands together?
Oh, it is. Thank you, my dear. You see why I have my wife to sit alongside me on these things. Good. Thank you. Yes. Attitude of prayer. Good. So we're going to move on. And we come to Simon of Cyrene and that reading that I gave you earlier. One whole verse about him. And the interesting thing about Simon, of course, is that he appears from nowhere. He's coming into the city from the country. It's always assumed, because Cyrene, if you don't know, is in Libya. It's always assumed that he is from the either a diaspora Jew or a Jew by conversion who's coming to the city for Passover and is making his way into Jerusalem as part of the Passover festival. And he's just grabbed by the soldiers and made to pick up the back of the cross and carry it. I'll just talk a bit more about Simon and then we'll look at the image. There's reference, as you see at the end there, Simon was from Cyrene, as I say, in Libya, and was the father of Alexander and Rufus. And it's assumed that because those people are named, that they must have been people that were known. Rufus does appear in the New Testament. There's a little reference to Rufus in Romans, And there's, I think, Alexander as a name is in one place as well. They were not uncommon names, but possibly the fact that they are named here shows that they did become people who were known within the early Christian church. That's only conjecture, or it could be that it's back written in some ways after they became part of the church. But I think the speculation always is, so Simon carried the cross. What effect did that have on him? I talked last week, didn't I, about the carrying the cross and what that felt like. And this whole situation that he's put into is so astonishing. And how did he feel about it? Just look closely at the picture and tell me what you see.
Well, I see a heart.
That's right, Ben. Yeah. I think the point is that they both have a heart and the two hearts are one. If you look where they are on the body, it's in the right place for Jesus and in the right place for Simon. And we might call a heart-to-heart relationship. I mean, obviously it's stylized. It's not how it would be. But I think that's a very interesting depiction. Heart, of course, what pumps the blood around. So we're looking at life and death. If you remember from the Nicholas Markel pictures from last week. So I didn't show you one of Mary because he doesn't show one of Mary. But he uses red very sparingly, but very effectively in these otherwise black and white pictures. Yeah. But the other thing to note is where the cross is. So the cross is not actually being held by Jesus at this point. Jesus is under the cross, separate from the cross. And Simon has stepped in and not just taken some of the weight, but taken all of the weight. And Jesus's arms aren't touching the cross either, as far as you can see. And the interplay of black and white is interesting because both of them are, some of their body is in black and some of their body is in white.
The centre pillar is shorter too, isn't it?
Yeah.
Compared to the image of the crosses we have in our churches.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Well, I'm not quite sure what the significance of the two white lines are at the bottom. It's almost like he's run his fingers up it and scraped it. I don't quite know why they are there. Interesting with the image from Chris Shawcross that he's got Simon even in more working clothes than Jesus. I mean, Jesus is in working clothes, but I think Simon is almost with his flat cap, a working class working man, and he's picked up the back of the cross. Jesus is still staggering under the weight. Look at the bend of the knees, and it's almost, I mean, if Simon picked up that cross in that position, it would be incredibly awkward, and he would struggle to take a lot of weight off Jesus because he hasn't got it centered at all. The center of gravity is in the wrong place for him to hold it. I love the flow of the clothes, the work that's gone into shaping the clothes, and you get that sense of movement there. Quite wonderful. But perhaps an image you'll carry into Holy Week is Simon with a flat cap. This one from the forest set is more difficult to see, really. I'll show you a close-up in a moment, but let's just have a look at the full picture, because this is more about the crowd than about Simon and Jesus. So he's pulled out of the crowd. So the crowd are there. The crowd are pointing. The crowd have got fists. The crowd are sort of crowding in on him, watching. There's real anger, I think, in the crowd. I love the man on the left-hand side with his arms on his hips, saying, well, what's going on here then? You can almost put words into the mouth of various ones. This slightly strange character immediately to the right here. What's he looking at? He's almost bowed over with the weight of the cross, although it's not on his shoulders. If I come to the close-up, oh, I thought I got it. See, I didn't put it in. Let's do it the other way. There we go. Jesus is the person behind, because that's where the halo is. Can you just see little outline of the halo? And then Simon has come behind him. If you remember on these images, it's only the crossbar, not the cross, that's being carried. And so Simon has come and he's sort of taking the weight into his arms, taking it off the back of Jesus. It's quite an awkward position, but perhaps the only way that he could possibly help him with a crossbar. But I really think you get the sense of the anger of the crowd and the noise there must have been within this.
I can see 3 in black.
Yes, there's a number of them in black, isn't there? Yeah. I just want to focus for a few minutes on Jonathan Clark as an artist. We talked about some of his work last week and the way that he uses this aluminium. But I'm going to show you in a few minutes a little film as to how he actually creates an image. This is not the easiest view to see, and the second picture shows it more carefully. You get the sense of Jesus climbing steps and bent over, and then Simon has come in on and balanced him up. Can you see? Let me just make it a bit bigger. So Jesus is on one side and Simon is on the other. They've both got their shoulders underneath the cross. It's that sense of coming up the steps that I think is helpful in the sequence. And steps appear 2 or 3 times in this sequence of images, but it's that you're climbing up, you're getting towards the top, and that's when it really is a strain in the carrying. Jonathan Clark has done a number of religious images, been commissioned by a number of different cathedrals to do work. And this one was installed in the Millennium Year in Ely. And I found it interesting because even the placing of the door is important. But if you think we are following the way of the cross, this is the way of the cross. It's the path leading to up the hill. You could almost feel Jesus staggering under the weight, having to walk in a zigzag pattern because of the steepness of the hill. And then the cross itself is unequal. Can you see? It's not a perfect cross. It's slightly offset. It's actually more like a holding cross where one wing is often...
Peter,
Say again, Ben.
I was thinking it is Jerusalem's path.
Well, yes. It's hard to know is the answer. What was in it wouldn't have been a straight line, because what you follow now in Jerusalem is round the street. So you're turning corners through the place. What it was like for Jesus is very hard to know, because we don't know exactly what it was like in those days.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't have been a straight line for sure.
No.
But this is 11 meters high. It's an enormous piece of work. And again, it's he's casting in aluminium, and he found some different ways of doing castings, And so this is an enormous thing that would have been flat cast on a sand bed. And this one, which is simply called Sign at Wimborne Minster in Dorset, aluminium that's then been gilded. If you look on the cross, you can see something of the little gold leaf that's been sort of almost embossed onto it. And if you can see behind the cross, again, you've got something of that zigzag path going away from it. But it's a triumphal cross rather than a sad cross. This is a cross that somebody is proud of. Somebody wants to show the value of it. But again, it's 10 meters long, an enormous piece of work. I don't know how on earth he cast this. I can't think that he could have cast it in one piece unless it was a very deep pit. But I found on his website there were two videos. I'm only going to show you the short version. There is quite a long version of him talking about his work and talking about the way that he creates these sculptures. If I just take you back to this image, if you look at the crossbar, I'll bring it across. Can you see there's almost like little bubbles, which is exactly how polystyrene's made up, of tiny little, almost like bead-like images. And when you've seen it, and then you see how he's making it, you'll see why it works. So with any luck, I'll show you this film. Was really interesting to see. And if you look now, when we come to the different images, you can kind of see where the polystyrene is and how it's been built up. And you can see that just those little bubbles, particularly on some of the sort of sharp edges. We'll come back, you'll see some of that later on. Here we are again with the Sisters of Turvey Abbey. And it's interesting
Sister of
the back
Turvey
of
Abbey.
this. Say again, Ben?
Where is Sister of Turvey Abbey?
Yes, well, Turvey Abbey is down in the south, and they're Benedictine nuns.
Ah,
So, and this is what they do to raise money. They make pictures and different things, and you can buy them as posters and in books, and that's one of the ways they raise money for their work.
thank you.
That's fine. I'm glad you asked.
Thanks.
But I think there's a number of interesting things with this. First of all, Simon has got what is not a turban, but some headgear to himself. And then in the background, again, we've got a child, but we've also got other crosses. And some of the references around the story of Simon of Cyrene, and as you'll hear later from Chris, is the fact that the other people would have been carrying their crosses as well. So we often think about Jesus making this journey alone, but other people would have been carrying their cross and making the same journey as he is. Soldier on the left-hand side with a gun is telling Simon to get his arm underneath and to take the weight of the cross. Second person I wanted to show you tonight is Simon Coda. We looked at some of his work, I think, at Advent. And I think this is a fascinating image. I've slightly blown up the top half of it, but I equally well could have tried to blow up the bottom half of it. Because these are two people under the crossbeam, side by side and arm in arm. So they've got their arms over the top, taking the weight on their shoulders, but they've got their arms around each other. I don't know if you've ever stopped and watched people who are carrying a coffin, or perhaps done it yourself, but you bind to the person on the other side of the coffin with your arm around them so that your shoulders are close together. And that, I think, is what Simon Coda is showing here. And if you look on the right-hand picture, you can see that the person in red is Jesus, because he's got the marks of the crown of thorns in his forehead. And so that must be Simon in the blue beside him. But it's a quite different interpretation, different way of helping, coming closer, coming together. I mean, I imagine Simon would have not been that keen to get that close to somebody. He probably didn't know why Jesus was convicted. Jesus, by this stage, had probably got a fair bit of blood pouring off him if he'd had that crown of thorns stuck on his head. Not sure I would have wanted to get that close to Jesus. And then the third person that I came across this week, and I hadn't seen his work before. I was looking for something else and came across this person. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce his surname, Ono Brakpeya. He's a Nigerian printmaker and is obviously incredibly well respected in Nigeria and across that part of Western Africa. He was raised a Christian, but was also steeped in traditional beliefs. He attended school where he was taught art, amongst other things, and then went on to life drawing classes and art classes at the British Council Art Club in Benin City, which I think is a wonderful description of a place, the British Council Art Club in Benin City. And he was inspired by some watercolor paintings. And first of all, got a job as an art teacher. And so this is around the mid-1950s. And then he went on to study further in 1957 at the Nigerian College of Art, Science and Technology. And he got a federal scholarship. And again, he was trained in the Western tradition, but he began to bring into what he was doing some of the more traditional native ways, both in terms of the techniques, but also in terms of what he was depicting. And he's gone on since then and is incredibly well respected, not least because in 1958, this is the bit I found most interesting, he was part of a discussion group around art that ultimately came to be known as the Zaria Rebels. Zaria was the place where the university was. And it was set up with the aim of decolonizing the visual arts. So if you think that up till that point, all the visual arts that were taught were based on Western art, Western techniques, Western paintings, Western imagery. And so this group began to give him confidence to express himself in his own ways. And therefore he tended to move away from the sort of Western imagery that we might be most familiar with and move to things that are slightly more traditional in the sense, for instance, that they were elongated figures. You might remember from some of the Western sculptures that perhaps you've seen even on things like antiques programs, how often they are elongated, slightly evoking the supernatural. So something might be both human and of of another style, another way. And then between 1967 and 1978, he did obviously a whole series of religious Christian paintings and sculptures, and the ones that we're going to look at are cuts. So it's a printing technique, and he got involved with different ways of printing and then using more traditional colors. And I just found this absolutely fascinating. I'll show you a better picture of what we're looking at. So you can see that the soldier at the back is in Nigerian uniform, if I can use that language. Jesus is the person in the middle, and you can see, and then Simon is the one who's taking the weight at the front. But then in the background, you've got these geometric shapes which are coming out of the Nigerian art forms. And you just see at the back that the soldier is carrying a club. But when I hunted around, having seen this picture, I then hunted around a bit further and could find very few other images from other parts of the world. I mean, I have seen Asian Stations of the Cross, but I couldn't remember seeing, and I have yet to find more African stations. There's no reason why they're not there. It's probably the fact that I've not actually come across them. So we finished this sequence on Simon with Chris reading one of her meditations. And I think you're going to say a little bit about it before you read it. Is that right?
Yeah, having thought about it this time. I wrote these all under the title, Were You There? And the idea was I would think about a number of people who might have witnessed the process up to the crucifixion of Jesus and how they might have felt and reacted at the time. And Simon of Cyrene, I took as some of the characters were based on the people in the church who I knew were going to read the parts, but I don't think this one was. I took this as they say he came into the city from the country. So this is a countryman, and he is rather conservative in his ways and also rather moralistic. But this is how he meets Jesus on this particular journey. I only came into the city because of the festival. I can't stand the city life or the city folk. Too much noise and hustle. Too many newfangled ideas. The people always about to riot, not knowing the meaning of real work. Law and order is what they need, or so I used to think. I passed by 3 criminals on their way to be crucified. 2 thieves, apparently, and 1 political transgressor, an insurrectionist. A disreputable lot, deserving to die. 2 soldiers pressed me to carry the cross for the insurrectionist Jesus, who was apparently ready to drop. I obeyed because I had to, and out of respect for the law, but I couldn't really see why I should. He should have thought of the consequences before he did what he did. He had made his own bed and should lie on it. Why should I have to put myself out for scum such as him? But as I took the heavy cross, he turned his face to me, and a look of gratitude passed wearily through his eyes. This man, dying for his beliefs, whether right or wrong I could not say, was thanking me for begrudgingly giving just a very little time and strength, and nothing of myself.
Thank you. I just put some of the other images there alongside because they're not ones I particularly wanted to speak about, although I think that last one does speak well to what Chris was just reading. So we move on to the third station tonight, station 6. His face is wiped by Veronica. So we'll just look at this image first of all by Chris Shawcross. What I couldn't find, what I wanted to find, was a picture of this from a different angle, because I can't see exactly what's passing between the two of them. If you don't know the story is that Veronica also comes from the crowd and uses, some would say a handkerchief, some would say a veil, in order to wipe the sweat and blood from Jesus's face. And you can just see something of that. If I make it a bit bigger, you can see that there is like a balled up cloth here. But I really wanted to get an angle from the side to see the interaction of the two. This story is based entirely on myth. There's no religious background to it at all. Even the name Veronica is kind of made up. And nothing really appears until about the 11th century, and possibly even later than that. If you think of the Turin shroud, Veronica's handkerchief is a similar relic. And it's said that she wiped the face of Jesus, and you can see the image of his face on her cloth. But as you can see from the bit at the bottom, her name is made up of two words, vero, which is true or truth, and icon, as in icon, for likeness. So she's called Veronica not because that was her name, and indeed I doubt whether it probably was a woman's name until after this had happened, but the cloth was said to have the true likeness of Christ on it. Therefore Veron, vero, true, icon, likeness is where the name comes from. But that being said, and I think little proof of anything of truth of the story. Again, it's about the tenderness shown to Jesus on the journey. And so just as that image we looked at earlier of Mary and the interaction between Mary and Jesus, and then the interaction between Simon and Jesus, now we have another woman who supposedly comes out of the crowd and is tender to Jesus, wiping his face. And it's interesting in this image from the Lincoln series, the Forest series, that you can see very clearly the crown of thorns on his head. And of course, the theory is that those thorns would have bitten into his forehead, and so the blood would have flowed. And so she comes to wipe the sweat and the blood from his face. Let me just make it a bit bigger. I love the left hand of the woman, the tenderness with which she's holding him. She's brought her face close to him, and then she's wiping it. When I was a child, growing up in Dover, we used to go to Rye for days out. And in the church in Rye, there was this picture, which I think is one in a number of places. I don't think they were the only place that had it. But imagine a child of 6 or 7 going into that church and seeing this picture on the wall. It was actually quite small. The face is life size, if you see what I mean. So the actual piece of cloth is no more than a foot 15 inches high. What this doesn't show, but what was very clear in that image in Rye, were the eyes And you know how a picture, the eyes follow you as you move around it. Well, that was definitely true. And that's my memory as a child of being almost scared witless by this picture of Jesus looking at me. And wherever I stood, to the left or the right or straight on, those eyes were piercing through you. And of course, it's part of this story that the veil of Veronica is now a Christian relic. And as with the Shroud of Turin, they have done some work on it to try and date it. But as I say, the earliest record is from around the 11th century, but actually the major records don't start until about the 1500s. But that's where the story comes from, and then that's how it is depicted in these images of the Station of the Cross. Quite how it dropped into the stations, I'm not sure, except that I think it's about the interaction of people, as Chris was just saying, that imagination about who was there and what they saw and what they entered into. I just draw attention, make it a bit bigger. You know, I was speaking about the polystyrene. Now look at this edge here, and you can absolutely see the polystyrene edge that's been burnt away in order to make the casting. I'm not quite sure how he's made the figures. I'm guessing that the different parts of the body and the head were joined together and stuck on. But you can see a bit more clearly from this angle how Veronica is approaching Jesus. And in this, it's almost like the sleeve of her dress that she's using rather than a separate piece that she's reaching forward in order to touch him. But I just draw your attention on the right-hand side to everybody else. Remember on the earlier picture, they were all looking on, and now all but one have turned their faces away, and the only one who's looking on is a little boy. He's watching you. Although this is so stylized, you can almost see the expression on his face. It amazes me how much this artist has got into the sculpture. And the people have turned away, turned their backs on Jesus, turned their heads down so they don't have to see what's going on. Not surprisingly, the image from Turvey Abbey is much more traditional. A white handkerchief wiping his face. And interestingly, Uriah Clark, two different images. Oh, Daisy's back. Her meeting must have finished. Two different images, which are similar, but they are quite different. Partly in sort of who is around and the detail of who's around. You can see they are two separate pictures, but some of the things are the same. So this is Simon in the background carrying. She doesn't have a picture of Simon of Cyrene carrying the cross. But Veronica is a very ordinary woman in a very ordinary dress. Indeed, her dress reminded me of some of the imagery that Stanley Spencer used of women in dresses of the time. But again, you've got a child involved down here. You've got a dark figure here that I think maybe in her mind a priest, because very often she depicted Catholic priests in her artwork. In the left-hand one, you get something of the anger of the children as well as of this adult. You do get it in the right-hand one, but a bit further away. And then I'm not quite sure what I make of this little picture at the back, which is of a child carrying a doll or a baby. And if I can remind those of you who were with me previously in Uriah Clark's work, we looked quite in some detail at it in her biography. She never had a child herself, but she always was working with children in the church and in the community where she lived and had a lot to do with children. And so perhaps this is her depiction of the children of the community coming into the picture, getting drawn into it, being part of it. And this person here on this side is much more sort of fleshed out, because actually at the bottom, can you see the shoes underneath? So she's like an old woman shouting at Veronica. And Veronica's got a little baby clinging onto her back as well. And again in that side. This is from that Nigerian person, Bruce Onabakpeya. Again, you've got the Nigerian soldier. And what is interesting, and it comes out most clearly here, though I think it's in all the pictures, is the cross is inscribed with Nigerian carving. Again, if you've seen on Antiques Roadshow or Flog It or one of those programs, when they show pieces of artwork from Africa, then they're very often quite deeply incised with carving, with geometric patterns. And he's picked that up in the cross. I mean, who would have made a cross like that? Nobody, of course. It would have been rough and wood, but he's wanted to depict that link back to his home country. And interestingly, it may be something to do with the technique that he used in the colouring. That Veronica has got a blue scarf that she's using rather than a white one, which will take the imprint of the face. Put these two side by side because I think they both show the tenderness of the touch. The left-hand one, as in the original, the first wooden sculpture by Chris Shawcross, the cloth is bunched up almost like a flannel being used on the face, and then on the right-hand side, it's open like an open handkerchief, an open veil. But I think both of them show something of the tenderness of the woman approaching Jesus and tenderly taking the blood and the sweat from his face. And then as we bring tonight towards a close, we come to the second image of Jesus falling. And so we have Jesus falling a second time. And what's interesting, I think, in this series is how Jesus is depicted sometimes through the sequence. And perhaps next week when we do the third fall, I might put falls 1 and 2 by the same artist alongside each other. Sometimes Jesus just gets lower and lower. So the first fall he's stumbling, the second fall he's halfway down, and the third fall he's hit the ground. Whereas Chris Shawcross not only has Jesus on the ground, but has the cross falling onto him. I think the power of that image in what is very small, I mean, it's what, 6-8 inches across. It's a tiny little piece of work, but you really get the force of that cross weighing down and coming on top of him. I think it's amazing. Again, if you go back to the image that we had earlier of Simon of Cyrene, if you look in the right-hand side, the crowd are there still, and they're shouting and screaming at Jesus. Jesus has fallen. We'll look at that in a moment on the close-up. But it's interesting, this little image at the top, because I think this is where Jesus is going. So he's carrying the cross piece of the cross, and he's going to the place where the upright is already planted in the ground, and the two soldiers are on either side of it. And I think it's fascinating, and we've seen it in the earlier pictures as well, how this artist is using that sense of travel and uses the wood to give a journey, the path that he's going to follow. And even the grain of the wood, can you see here, almost flows. Where on earth he found this piece of wood in order to get that movement in it? But there's movement there in the way that the wood grain, the tree rings flow, and you get that movement up, forwards and upwards. And I think this person particularly is saying to Jesus, that's where you've got to go. So this arm points to Jesus, and this arm points upwards to where the upright is already. Oh. And in all of them, Jesus falls in an angular way. He's really has fallen. It's not a controlled laying down of the weight. This is Jesus literally tumbling to the ground, tripping over, falling down, and the weight of the cross weighing him down. I mean, assuming that this is as it was in the previous images by this artist, then the cross beam is across his shoulders and it's now pushing his head forward. He's fallen on his back, and the head is pushed forward. You can feel the agony of it. And again, just look at the way he's used the tree rings here to depict the knees and the leg. Just absolutely amazing work that's gone into every single tiny little piece of work. And in Jonathan Clark, Jesus again is getting nearer to the ground. The people have turned back to look this time. And if we look from the side, here's Jesus on his knees, the weight of the cross bending him over, really pushing him down. And the ground, if you notice, has changed from behind him, from being smooth to in front of him being rugged. As I say, every single little piece is important. And this is the second of Frank Roper's images. So again, Jesus falls for the second time. And in the background, you have two Roman soldiers very much in Roman dress, as we would expect them to be, with their helmets on, their togas. And then Jesus again on the way down. So he's stumbling. He's lost control. He's lost control of the weight of the cross, which is why in that first picture from Chris Shawcross, it's as if the cross is tumbling on top of him. It's not a controlled landing in any shape or form. He's going to end up face down in the dirt, and the weight of the cross coming on his shoulders and pushing down into his back. I've always thought what's interesting about these images is that he's used metal for wood, and the wood is what holds the metal. I don't think the upright pieces of wood at the back are there by coincidence. It could have been placed on a white piece of painted board. It could have been placed on all sorts of different things, but he's chosen to use this grained wood to depict the picture. What you might notice with these images is that the crosses behind Jesus get more and more. So we looked earlier and we saw there were 3 crosses shown, and now how many have we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 maybe. The weight of the cross is being added to by more and more crosses. Mary Clark's images are really very brutal. If we look at the right-hand one first of all, the man is using a spear, so it's an allusion, I think, to Jesus when he's nailed to the cross and a spear is put in his side. And the foot here is undoubtedly putting the boot in, literally, quite literally, the violence of it. And then on the left-hand side, again, the boot is going in, and the soldier here who's got the spear is saying, get up, get moving. You've got the intimidation of a dog in the picture as well, a dog alongside a soldier. There were, I think, 5 soldiers depicted here, alongside Jesus, who's down below, and Simon of Cyrene, who's still carrying the weight. Jews are obviously very important to her again. On the Zacchaeus image, again, the cross has got that carving into it. The cross has actually fallen very awkwardly. But what do you notice? The soldier now is holding the weight of the cross off Jesus. There's almost a bit of tender compassion from the soldier towards the man that he's going to take away to crucify. And of course, the colour has changed. The colour has gone to much more subdued black, whites, browns. I commented earlier about Noyes Capehart putting different animals, so we've now got a sheep in the picture and a family that almost is Mary and Joseph and the baby. I think it's almost cross-referencing Bethlehem with Jerusalem, and maybe it's the shepherd and the Lamb of God coming into the picture. But Jesus is out of control. I mean, he's lost control of this heavy weight. There's a cat there as well, if you haven't noticed. Oh, hang on, go back up. Black cat looking at you. And I think the last image tonight is from Margaret Adams Parker. Jesus falls for the second time. Jesus' arms have got the ropes on. There's no cross. No cross. He's down on his knees. He's exhausted. He's in pain. He's carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, even if he's not carrying the crossbar or the cross itself. And so, a prayer. Lord Jesus, you were worn down by fatigue. Be with those from whom life drains all energy. You needed the help of a passing stranger. Give us the humility to receive aid from others. To you, Jesus, weighed down with exhaustion and in need of help, be honour and glory with the Father and the Spirit now and forever. Amen. I'll just stop recording and then we'll come back together for a moment.